Welcome, Don, to our second conversation with Don Thompson, and welcome everyone. Don, we had some loose ends, some topics that we weren't able to discuss last time, and one of those was the paradigms of cooperation versus competition versus domination. And I was wondering what thoughts you had around that.
Well, I mean, I think that there are definitely alternatives that we have in front of us, you know, vis-a-vis the current situation or the current system. So let's call the current system global capitalism, globalization, and its children. So I think that, to me, I do believe that there are some new models of economy and social organization that are arising out there and that are, you know, making some headway in academia that are interesting. And also, I think that specifically as a country, I like, you know, not to idealize Costa Rica too much, but I certainly do like Costa Rica's model that they've put in place, where they basically have no army per se. They've taken the money that they would, you know, put into the military, and instead they put it into education and a literacy campaign, which means that I think they're at a 97% literacy rate in Costa Rica or something like that. And the net result of the programs that were put in place very early, or relatively early on, let's say the 1940s, is that they have a fairly stable situation or stable economy and stable society in Costa Rica. And when you compare that to some of the other Central American countries like Nicaragua, I think you've got a compare and contrast that is really compelling and something that could be used as a discussion point. So Nicaragua, yeah.
So before we go into Costa Rica, I would like to go, so when you say that there are new models,
yes,
such as other than Costa Rica, is it basically Costa Rica, or what else are you referring to?
No, I was just starting with Costa Rica. It's sort of a real world example of a new approach, of a different approach. So now
the only thing with Costa Rica is that obviously they're very dependent on the U.S. economy, because they have a huge community of American citizens, and obviously also American economical, you know, investments and interests, which kind of gives them some sort of protection, and they rely on the protection of, you know, of the U.S. and other countries. So what you're saying is true, but at the same time, and it is true that they're in this very, I mean, compared to Nicaragua, they have this huge influx of people who try and get in from Nicaragua to Costa Rica because their economy is better.
Right.
But again, it's what do countries, for example, like the US, who doesn't have a big brother, so to speak, Costa Rica has big brothers that kind of look after its balance, because there are, you know, communities and economic interests, different things that are not Costa Rican, so they have this kind of safety net bubble. My question, I guess, would be how, I don't know if self-standing is the way, but how authentic is really this change if they're so reliant on other powers?
Right. Well, I think that does get back to some of the discussion last time, which is change begins with the individual, and then what is the worldview that people have looking out, and that worldview then propagates itself through the economic system, us versus them, competition, and so on. So I think that in terms of a new model, what I like is this idea of universal basic services. So there is, I think, some movement in Europe toward that, in that direction. So starting off with basic income, but also looking at healthcare, housing, education. Basically, this is keying off of FDR's second Bill of Rights, a speech that he gave around 1944. So in the Second Bill of Rights, the FDR laid out sort of a vision of areas that could be covered by a democracy in terms of economic, moving an economy forward and creating a sustainable, livable situation within any given country. Obviously, he's focusing on the United States after World War II. So, but the thing I like about universal basic services is I think that a real issue is that we're stuck in this idea of what it is that is basic infrastructure. So if you could look at universal basic services as a new level of infrastructure, 100 years ago, we did not have interstate highways. We did not have the internet. We did not have this kind of infrastructure. If you raise the level of infrastructure, you then create a basis from which a free market economy, can prosper and grow. So you can have a situation where you have universal basic services, which, you have people on the right that kick and scream and say, how can you say that these are rights? How can you say that these are anything that the government should be remotely involved with if you want to keep free enterprise going? But and healthcare is a perfect example. If you created a new level of infrastructure around Medicare for all, it's obvious to any thinking person that it's much more cost effective to do so. And then you create a new level of infrastructure, more cost effective, on top of which can grow a new type of economy, some of which we haven't even envisaged yet. We don't even know what that is. I mean, I think the internet has given some indication of what it could be, in that the new kinds of services and the new economy built on the internet is an example that you could have things that grow out of that you don't know. There's new potential. So, but a lot of the social energy gets sucked out of that potential because we're so involved in maintaining the status quo of large corporate control of these big chunks of what should be basic rights or basic services. So I'll leave it at
I have a thought around that. I think that I agree with what you're saying, but I think that in part, what makes us so uncomfortable, and as I talk as a society,
yes,
what makes us so uncomfortable with these ideas is that we are accustomed and we are built in our worldview is around dichotomy. It's about us versus them. It's about mine versus yours. And we're very uncomfortable as a culture with blurred lines. Mm-hmm. So for example, if you're talking of a free market society that at the same time looks after the basic rights of its citizens, then that is a blurred line. And some people would say, no, that is communism, that is socialism, that is an overpowering state, and it doesn't have to be that way. But I think that we're accustomed to this dialogue in many aspects of our, different aspects of our life, in which we go directly into black and white. We haven't learned to be comfortable with different ways of merging what works and doing without that doesn't. So I think that beyond just the actual systems, it goes back to this thought of separation. And beyond, and again, if you think about corporations, it basically is about having very rigid lines, not having blurred lines, because once you start to have blurred lines, all these questions pop up. Really, how much are their product, contributing to society? How much are their margins taking away from, communities' growth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I understand that there's some interests that just aren't comfortable with anything but rigid lines of division between mine and yours.
So I think the one responsible party for why that us versus them narrative keeps continuing is, of course, the major media. So any journalist that goes to school in a university today, I'm sure that they will teach you that good storytelling involves conflict. If good story involves conflict, there's always a hero and a villain. There's a hero's journey, there's an us versus them. there's some arc, there's a narrative arc that needs to be fulfilled, that there's a hero and there's a villain. So if you have, you could look at the Democrats and the Republicans, and they're constantly on a hero's journey against one another. It's this unbroken record of the hero's journey being played out, usually during a very well predefined timeline within the news cycle. So that in itself, by creating those kinds of conflicts, those narratives of conflict, keep people from thinking about the real issues, keep people from thinking about inequality, keep people from getting together and organizing and coming up with real solutions, because they've got them, it's a divide and conquer strategy, basically. And I think that Mr. Trump is a genius at divide and conquer, for example. Mm-hmm. But I think he's well supported by, the members of the so-called liberal media, who also promote, narratives of us versus them in conflict.
Well, I would say at this point, most media.
Yes.
I mean, we just saw what happened with the possibility of having Bernie Sanders as the Democratic candidate for the presidency. Right. And immediately, like most media that were considered to be actually, most media that were supposed to not fall within the Trump ranks started going with Biden and going against Bernie Sanders. It was very interesting to see that immediate reaction, because again, Bernie is talking about blurred lines. He's not talking about rigid lines, and he's not even, and it's interesting because I think where he failed was he was never able to really explain that his ideas were not communist, unfortunately, in short phrases.
Right.
He would explain it in long paragraphs and obviously wouldn't make the cut. When they edited his sound bites, the parts where he was explaining just common sense didn't make the cut. Right. But yes, that's interesting. Now, talking about conflict and journalism, yes, it is true that there is a lot of us versus them. The interesting thing is that there are many stories that people really enjoy and have to do with internal conflict and growth, which are the human interest stories.
Right.
So it's not that journalism cannot exist without creating conflict, because there is already enough conflict within each one of us.
Absolutely.
And just, kind of the curve or your narrative has interest in just a sense of how that character grows or fails to grow.
Right.
In facing these internal conflicts. So right. there is a way to do journalism that doesn't play out these rigid lines and us versus them.
And I would say that same mindset would seep into it. It's very dominant in narrative feature filmmaking as well, in fiction film. So not to promote myself too much, but I did write this book of essays called War Without War. And one of the essays I had in there was called Peace as Style. Peace as Style. So Peace as Style talked about issues of violence in the media, but also delved into some areas of narrative filmmaking and like the ideas of universal basic services within the world of art. There's been alternatives proposed and run up the flagpole. So there is a real desire within the American media, dominant American media, to have a certain kind of violent media. When I say violent, I mean kinetic editing. I mean editing that moves forward so quickly that you have no time to think, which creates a short attention span, which loops back around to the issue that you just described, where they need short phrases. They need it simple. They need it straightforward. Why? Because they can't think. Why? At least they're perceived as not being able to think. I'm not saying that people can or cannot think. I don't know. They're not given a chance for the most part. But I would say that there have been alternatives, particularly within Europe and also within India, but within Europe in particular. After the devastation of World War II, there were a number of filmmakers that rose up in intuitive and very very aware response to the devastation of World War II. Their primary goal was humanistic, okay? So the American films, for the most part, you can look at Marvel Comics as a primary example, or other films, the violent, kinetic loudness of them, if you go into the Cineplex and listen, watch those films, they're so violent and kinetically edited. There's no way that anybody has any room to think. They don't want you to think. They just want you to be carried off and swept through the narrative arc of the hero's journey, for the most part, the mythic worldview that they're trying to promote, which also very neatly segues into a military stance, a militaristic, violent view of the world, and a colonialist and neo-colonialist view of the world, which is dominate, control, subdue the other meaning the other in the other world, the other nations, in order to what? In order to control and maintain those resources. So
well, and it goes back to the individual as well.
It's all sort of tied together is the point.
Yeah, I mean, it's at every level.
It's at every level.
The only thing I would say is it's a little bit disheartening to know that there is this humanistic kind of wave in Europe that really basically hit the wall of, I guess, globalization. Because if you look at Europe today, the amount of populism in their leaders and the us versus them, especially towards migrants and toward third world countries, is as evident as it is in the US.
Exactly. So how did that happen? And I'm telling you, believe me, if you did a historical analysis, you would trace the growth of, let's call it mythic filmmaking. Let's call it hyper-violent mythic filmmaking a la Marvel Comics movies, some of which have interesting themes. I'm not saying that they're totally black and white and some of them aren't interesting. Some of them can be. But for the most part, the idea is to move away from the human to the superhuman, to move away from the humanistic to the mythic. So the mythic hero's journey, as we talked about. So basically, if you look at historically, you would see the march of the corporate takeover after the formation of the EU. Then you have, and you can see this in the marketplace in films in Europe. And this happened, Netflix also is partly involved in this as well as we speak. It's a little bit different and a little bit more nuanced and complex than I'm laying out. But generally speaking, the growth of violent media has led to a downgrading, I think, of the humanistic worldview, which dominated in Europe post-World War II, and has allowed for the rise of populism. I think that there's a correlation. I'm not saying that it's all due to that, but I think it's a syndrome. Or maybe it's a symptom.
You know what I mean? Like, I mean, it goes both ways. It's symbiotic.
One drives the other. I understand what you're saying. So whether or not it's a cart before the horse, and I would, because I, as a media producer, someone who would like to think that they're trying to take some level of responsibility for what they're producing, and to put out messaging out to the population that I believe is positive and will lend itself towards a sustainable cultural situation moving forward into the future. I take responsibility for that. I'm not trying to brag, but I think we need more people to take responsibility. We need more people to be aware of the impact of what they're doing. And what they're doing in the media, ultimately, if I know that they're getting paid a ton of money to do it, and of course that's very, appealing. But on the other hand, if we're going down a path of self-destruction, which in many ways is becoming painfully apparent with coronavirus. I mean, coronavirus has totally laid bare all of the weaknesses of our current system. And people may be, really amped up and can't wait to get back to the way things were before. But if you look at India right now, they can see the Himalayas where they haven't been able to see those mountains in 30 years. And that's but one example of the incessant assault on the environment that humanity has created through global capitalism, through our incessant desire to dominate nature and subdue it toward whatever ends we see fit, mostly being related to profit.
The only thing I would like to kind of take some steps back and add to what you were saying is, to me, it's not so much about how many discourses and how many narratives or points of view are expressed. To me, the most pressing issue is the lack of dialogue on the other end. Like, what we put out there can not only be lecturing people. What we put out there really has to make people think. And most importantly, now that we have means to have an interactive experience with content, we should be creating spaces for social dialogue, for people to participate actively in what they're being given, process it, and throw something back in which their own point of view is included. And that may be something we like or do not like to hear, it doesn't matter. The important thing is that as long as everybody's speaking and nobody's listening, there's no dialogue. And when there's no dialogue, you can't achieve change. You're just going to have two very polarized points of view, and that's it. And everybody is going to be happy either on this end or on that. But that coming together to say, okay, we have different points of view, we think differently, we see the world in a different way, and yet we're coming together to see what can we build that doesn't make you versus me, but makes it us. That is what I think is lacking. And it's lacking on both ends from my point of view. I mean, you have a Michael Moore who obviously, you know, some people will follow, and he rants, and that, you know, he does what he does and he contributes whatever he contributes. But the thing is, how much does he really contribute towards dialogue? That's the question.
Okay, so if that's the question, then, because I have to say that I'm a very goal-oriented person. I think, well, what's the purpose? What's the intent? So if the intent of dialogue is dialogue itself, which is very Socratic, very Greek, and can lead to truth, right? So according to Socrates, or at least a realization of what you don't know, what we don't know.
Yes, 100%.
So, you know, if there's dialogue, well, to me, at least, I think in terms of lecturing or top down or putting the information out, I think it is the duty of scientists and academics and those that think about these things to think about them in a sense, you know, lecture us, to tell us, give us the hard facts, give us the information, and then we can dialogue based upon a framework of reality as opposed to a framework of myth or a framework of whatever we happen to be dreaming of. So I think that it's important to have, now there lies the debate. Well, what is reality?
Exactly.
What's the reality that you're voiced upon? Because Mr. Trump would say, well, the scientists are just,
no,
that's their opinion.
I mean, we can't have scientists who are dogmatic. Right. It serves no purpose. If somebody says that they have the truth, then I'm already skeptic.
Oh, yeah.
Because this is the thing, science, true science and scientific thinking is actually questioning everything all the time.
Right.
And whatever you thought was, isn't necessarily what is. We have Einstein's theories who were the truth until now that we're exploring more quantum mechanics. And he's just an example. We could go back to Newton, etc. Like, things evolve as long as we have a scientific, and we call it scientific, but as long as we have a curious mind. And I was thinking about this recently. At some point we lose that because children are very curious. And they're just there, they want to learn. And they're not like, I already know, like, don't explain it to me. But at some point we lose that. And we feel in our own insecurity that we have to demonstrate that we know it all. Because if we don't, then we're a lesser being. And that forces us to make all these assumptions and keep building on things that really don't have solid foundation in just the fact of being skeptic and questioning. So when we talk about reality, yes, I get that science can give us fact, but there are other facts that are equally valid. If I'm going to talk to somebody who works in agriculture and the challenges they're going to face with the border restrictions now with COVID-19, and the fact that they won't get seasonal workers to actually plant their crops, and what impact that is going to have not only for them, but let's just talk about their reality. For them, their economy, their family economy, they have these huge plots of land and all the equipment, but maybe they're a family of 5, 6, and that's a large family, who haven't planned in not relying on these seasonal workers. So they actually, that situation is a fact. It's not scientific, it's pragmatic, but it's still a fact. And that is where I think we need to have dialogue in which we say, everything that is contributed, as long as it's sharing to be discussed, should be accepted. It shouldn't be, just give me the fact and you have to have such and such background to participate. I think we need to actually allow voices to come from different points of view and experiences.
I agree. So there's a certain level of practicality, I guess, to that statement. I mean, how do we do that? How do we actually execute that? So there usually would be some kind of, there committees or somehow people are allowed to have a representative. Let's say, for example, if we moved into a situation where we eventually, I'm not saying tomorrow, but eventually move into some kind of a truth and reconciliation movement, okay, post whatever we call this current system, globalization, capitalist globalization, whatever. To whatever extent it is corrupted or corrupting should be vetted in the light of day. And there should be a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, so to speak, that does that, similar to South Africa, or similar to the Nuremberg trials, I would think. So I don't know how far we are to get to that point or if we ever will. But I do think that some kind of a truth and reconciliation movement, which exists to a certain extent on the internet already, but then you have issues of, well, what is the truth that's being reconciled, and does everybody agree with it, and so on and so forth. But I would say, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, no, I would just say that I think that it is patently obvious to a lot of people that there's corruption. So I think that we can agree that there's corruption. So then when the master is corrupt, and the master has no master, you have a problem. How do you get to a place where you can actually have that light shown on that situation in a truth and reconciliation? You have no big brother, as you said before, to be the frame through which that truth and reconciliation can occur.
However, that self-sustained big brother should have a social contract by which the household is able to actually have a say in the direction that the big brother takes. So we're talking about, say, the US. Our social contract on paper says that it is a government of the people for the people. And it may have been written in a way that really was a little bit discriminatory and it wasn't for all the people, it doesn't matter. But today we should take it as all the people.
Sure.
and taking this a step back, when talking about, say, for example, content,
Mhm.
my personal view is that I think more and more of these projects that try and shine a light over different issues, social issues, will have to become transmedia projects. So one of the challenges, and that's how, as you know, I'm working on this documentary that's called Reconstructing Eve. And it's about reconstructing the feminine versus the masculine and so forth. So one of the challenges was, okay, so beyond just saying or sharing a point of view, how do you create dialogue that also actually leads to action, that actually leads to having an impact and making change? So in talking to a friend who I'm working with now, the idea came that we needed to have a structure that permitted study circles and workshops and kind of have different facets to not only creating content, but actually, since nobody's going to do it, us having to kind of create this literally a structure that allowed for dialogue, that allows for awareness, and that can then lead to palpable action and measurable impact. So I do think for those of us who want to share ideas, it's we're going to have to step it up, and take it one step further and actually see, okay, so other than sharing what I think, how can I if we really want change, and then how do you control these big brothers? Again, supposedly it's about your vote to begin with.
Exactly.
Supposedly it's about choosing your representatives in a way that doesn't respond to your urgent needs, but to a long-term vision of where you want to be as a country. The thing is, how do, within this whirlwind of polarized information, how does a citizen actually stop thinking about his or her immediate needs? Say, for example, this farmer, how does this farmer stop thinking about his immediate or her immediate needs and start thinking about a vision when dialogue isn't taking us there? What would you say?
Well, I would go back to universal basic services as a starting place. But it's again the cart before the horse. How do we get there? How do we allow for that person, not only the farmer, but the busy mom who's taking her kids to soccer and doing this and that and working and blah, blah, blah. How do we allow people the time to even think, get off the treadmill and think about anything, little less their own survival that's in front of them? I mean, that's a big problem. So I think in Europe, we're starting to hear some movement towards UBI, Universal Basic Income, which, if it rolls out over the course of time, over many years, could perhaps begin to create a situation where we would at least have peoples, in democracies, hopefully in Europe to start. I don't see much of a chance here unless there's an absolute revolution of sorts. So it could happen, but it would have to happen based upon complete economic upheaval.
So before I ask why do you think that would be part of the solution, I mean, it's in a way, and I know it's terrible for everybody who's lost a loved one, but in a way, COVID-19 and these crises do bring kind of a blessing because they force us, even as government, they force us to look at things differently. Right. Thinking of actually giving all Americans a paycheck, so that they can survive these basically months of shutdown, a basic shutdown, economic shutdown, would have been unthinkable. It would have been unthinkable for Republicans and Democrats to actually say, you know what, we're just going to hand a check to everyone so they can kind of like ride the wave. And now they're talking about a second package of financial aid or just of injecting money into the market, into the economy. So change sometimes happens in the least expected ways, and I think this in a way has shown us that most likely there will be another pandemic. This is not going to be the last one. To see how we respond will be interesting. But what I'm saying is, I think things like this start to change people's mindset. And maybe now having a universal basic income doesn't seem so far-fetched, especially
Absolutely.
taking into account all those people who worked in manufacturing whose jobs are going to go offshore at some point if they haven't already.
Right, right. So that's all good, and I agree with that. And I certainly was aware of those trends. And I think that, when you hear what Mr. Trump would like to have happen, it's return to the way it was without any change in, I don't know, April 30th, right? So will that happen? Who knows? But the point being is the current leadership wants it to go back to exactly the way it was. And we may have had a brief glimpse of some of these ideas being propagated through the system. But unless we have again, you would indicate, I would, certainly not want another pandemic. But if we are creating a situation with the environment where the natural course of events for nature is to fight back against the pandemic of humanity that exists on the planet, to the planet, in other words, that we're destroying the planet. If the planet, if it's only a natural occurrence that to cull populations, that this is why viruses occur, you could say in nature, I'm sure there's probably some literature around that, it culls the population, it reduces the population. So that would be a natural way to address some of these issues of the environment. So my vote is for human choice to preempt that, so that we don't have to get there to have nature having her voice. And you could argue, about Gaia and world consciousness.
Yeah, the only thing I would like to add there is I'm not that friendly to the idea of creating Earth as an entity that actually has a choice in calling or not.
Right.
I like to see this more as a logical succession of actions from, again, if as a species you're invading the territory of other species, there's going to be much more probability of you being exposed to viruses you weren't exposed before. To me, that's completely logical.
It's causing
keep on kind of invading all these different environments where other species, wild species live. Like, what are we expecting? Obviously, there's going to be a lot of more exchange of bacteria, viruses, etc., and that is going to have an impact, which is what happened this time. So it's not that this entity, and I'm just worried about this kind of magical religious, thread of thought and kind of mysticism that this entity came and said, enough with the humans. I mean, it's much more logical than that, and we are much more responsible for what we're living. Just the Earth wanted to shake us off.
Yeah, I got you. So I think you can get there completely with taking the logical perspective that you laid out. You can come to the same conclusions. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is, if you don't believe that there is some intelligence, I mean, if you look at the universe is intelligent. I mean, it has an intelligence to it. Now, whether that intelligence is conscious or sentient, that's another debate. But there is an intelligence working, and it works. You could say it works itself out through natural law, through the laws of nature, certainly. But there is intelligence, and there is actually a tendency toward homeostasis, to balance. That's really the general trend of the universe, a constant play of forces to reach a place.
I guess what I rebel against is the idea of intent. intent. That's the thing. When you say that Gaia, has decided to kind of like, shake us off her shoulder, that's intent.
Well, I would say that you have to look at the results though. I mean, the result, you can lay into it anything you want. You can lay into no intent or whatever, regardless of what you want to do. And I completely, believe me, I have a completely rational mind and am able to completely, with absolute razor sharp precision, analyze something, and not to brag, but I'm just saying I can use that intellect.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, I do understand people of faith, and I empathize with people of faith.
You can have, yeah.
And those people of faith, by the way, will be a big part of the committee of the voices that will want to be heard, within any given dialogue. So I think that, well, what is that? What is the place of faith? What is the place of that kind of viewpoint? And what does it really mean? Well, what it means to me is that the rational mind, as expressed through science, has just about, within the course of a few decades, destroyed the planet. So this beautiful, wonderful, rational mind that we all love so much, and we talked about this before. I mean, I think the indigenous cultures, which are very religious cultures, very, very, you call them faith-based, whatever you want to call them, but there was an intelligence behind that told them, that indicated to them the lifestyle that they should lead is one that is not damaging to the environment. And it's certainly a lot of American Indian cultures live that way. And I think that there's a downside to that. I'm not saying there isn't a downside. And I'm not saying there isn't an upside to modern technology and modern ways of viewing things and all of that stuff, a lot of which I adhere to and believe in and support and use. So, but I'm saying that I do believe, that, and I think it is an interesting nub of a dialogue, and because I think, if I look at, let's look at Buddhism, for example. Okay, now I'm a practitioner, you might say, of Buddhism. Buddhism is not a religion. It's a way of approaching problems. It's a way of analyzing. So now it has been taken into and become a religion to many people. And there's a whole series of discussions we could get into regarding, Tibetan Buddhism, for example, which I've followed for quite a number of years. But at the core of Buddhist philosophy is an analytical method. And I'm not trying to convert or promote, or maybe I'm a little bit, but I'm not trying to certainly convert anybody to a non-religion. But I would say that the bottom line is that there is an analytical framework that's available to us to use, and that then can help us to see clearly without delusion. And I think that to the extent that we can do that, we'll all be better off, whether that's through what we call Buddhism or some other method. I think that the rational thinking people need to be able to work with the faith-based people, of which a majority of the people are, rather than being manipulated by the populace.
The only thing is, I would argue against that in a way that I don't think that science has led us in its rationality to where we are.
Right.
I think that people have used science in an irrational way to lead us to where we are. And you don't necessarily have to go or not towards faith. That is an option.
Yeah.
And I think it's valid. Whatever you believe in, that's fine with me. But I do think that science is not an entity. Science is a process. It's a methodology of something that is or should be inherent to every human being, which is observing, analyzing, and reaching conclusions. And you can do that through religion. You can do that through what we call science, which is only a methodology in different specialties, or for whatever means you want to use. But when we lose that as human beings, that is when we get into trouble. So I understand what you're saying, but what I would say is really, it doesn't matter where we come from, we have to come together. It doesn't matter if we're religious or non-religious. We embrace a rational point of view, and if we don't, we should, because I don't think we should have irrationals on the I mean, if we're going to have irrationals at the table, it should be to kind of help them rationalize their lack of rationality. But I think that's the key thing. It's everybody. Like, this involves everyone. It's not, there's no one group. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, because everybody's impacted in the same way.
Well, the one thing that the faith people do get is love. So I think that to the extent that the rational people, let's call them the rational group, let's say that the science that you've indicated, that I agree with you, that it isn't science per se, it's science misused, the rational mind misused towards
irrational. You cannot be a rational mind if you're looking at the effects of what you're doing as being negative, and you still continue to do it. That is not rational.
Well, of course. So what I'm saying is that the faith people, if they really, in my mind, are truly practicing what they preach, do bring to the table love, or can bring to the table love. And I do believe that love is a force, a real force, that would be very useful and probably indispensable to bring people together in a unified way to move forward. Because if people are basing their dialogue out of a basic intention of love, then I think that that is a place where dialogue can occur, and that the fruits of that dialogue will be beneficial almost by default. I don't think that a lot of the decisions that have come out of our current White House or previous White Houses, or the corporate community and their quest to create the latest new schwazzy product, that they aren't thinking about its impact on the global environment, okay, would not happen if they were intended by love. Now, love sounds kind of touchy-feely and blah, 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 but it is a real force. It is an actual real thing that faith people understand, that families understand, that mothers and children understand, and so on and so forth. And we all know this. Again, so I'm just saying that I think that that could inform our dialogue, and that I think that there is a that is the equipoise. That's the equipoise, the love, the center. If we look back to the religious traditions of the equipoise between the masculine and the feminine, it is united in love. So again,
so maybe what I would say is, let's not use religious people.
Sure.
Let's use spiritual people.
Spiritual people, that's fine.
Celebrate life, period. Because you have to celebrate life. You cannot only celebrate humans. And I don't like to use religious people, because I cannot believe that somebody who is, like you say, rational and analyzes life is able to believe that when you're talking about hierarchy, only men should be leading, because men are only 50% of the population. So that has no rationale whatsoever. And you can look at Buddhists, you can look at Catholics, you can look at different religions. Once you start making differences between gender of one same species, to me, you already lost all rationale. What you're doing again is responding to something that has nothing to do with love, nothing to do with the rational mind, but has to do all really with personal interest and power. So let's, if we're talking about spiritual people who celebrate life, 100%. But I think that everybody should do that. I mean, we should not only be people who question or people who celebrate. I think we can be both.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you about spirituality, certainly. So I think that ideally, if you were to bring some people out of the closet regarding their religiosity, and if you led them down the path of love, so to speak, that religion is not necessary, really. It's a sort of baggage. It's sort of a structure of control, a structure of manipulation. It usually goes hand in hand with the economic system in many ways. Certainly it has in the United States, and it certainly did in colonialism. So
Talk about India and the idea of reincarnation. You
right.
know, how is it possible that you're supposed to be in this case or whatever it is, you know, forever, just because you did something in a past life you can't even remember? Like, very convenient for the people who are, you know, not at the bottom tier.
Exactly. But I would say moving forward, I think that for all of us interested in helping society move forward to whatever is the next step, which I think that you and I are both on, you know, we have a sincere desire to help facilitate that in whatever way we can.
Yep.
So I think that to have a mindset of compassion, empathy, and to listen, as you've indicated in your desire for dialogue among people, which I think is extremely laudable, extremely great thing. That's wonderful. So I just think that I do see a tendency among some on the left, and certainly on the right, we know that. And you know, a fascism of the left or the right would not be the way to go. So I think that we have a danger of extremism on either the left or the right. So to avoid that, I think that to come to that place, that is why I like the Buddhists in their conclusion about compassion. So I think that if you come from a compassionate, empathetic stance, you can avoid those extremes, which lead us down a very, very slippery slope, and usually towards violence and war. So if we want to avoid that, you know, that's the point. And I think that we're not disagreeing there at all.
Oh no, I completely agree.
I think that on the spirituality issue, I think that we're also in agreement to lead us towards a moment of.
Yeah, we actually have three topics to discuss, but
Oh,
I mean, I don't think we're even done with because we haven't even explored competition versus domination.
Oh,
you know, so but anyway, thank you so much, Don, and we'll continue our conversations, definitely.
Okay, great. Thank you.